Now to a book which rather happily draws together a couple of the stories we've been looking at today, tobacco and climate change. In Merchants of Doubt, Professor Naomi Oreskes reveals that scientists favoured by the climate change sceptics are not only using the playbook from the tobacco industry's defence against health lawsuits back in the 1970s, in many cases it's the same scientists that wrote the playbook. They're back. Naomi Oreskes is in Australia to attend this week's Sydney Writers' Festival, and she's with us on the drum. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Now, first of all, who are these shadowy or not so shadowy figures, the scientists that were involved with big tobacco in the 70s and are now in the climate change denial business today?
Well, in our book, Merchants of Doubt, what we asked the question was, who are these scientists who say there's no global warming, that it's just caused by natural variability? And we were able to, through historical research, trace these people back to their origins in a think tank created in 1984 called the George C. Marshall Institute. But even before that, we found that the key people in the story, including the founding chairman of the board of the Marshall Institute, a man by the name of Frederick Seitz, had worked in the 1970s and 80s with the U.S. tobacco industry.
Now, are these scientists who have legitimate, honestly held doubts in the finest, rigorous traditions of science, or are they in some way compromised or corrupted?
Well, I don't know if I would put it exactly either of those. I mean, they were real scientists. That's partly how they had credibility. It's partly why people listened to them. They were physicists. Frederick Seitz was a president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, so they were real scientists, and that was key to the story. But, of course, that was what the tobacco industry had recognized, that if their claims that the science regarding tobacco was uncertain, that we didn't really know if tobacco was hazardous, for that claim to be credible, it wouldn't really do for a tobacco industry executive to say it, because most of us would be smart enough to realize that was not a credible claim. But if they could find scientists, prestigious scientists, who would say, well, we're not really sure about the science, that would have much more credibility with the public, and especially with journalists, because a lot of this was about targeting journalists. So the tobacco industry actively recruited scientists to support their position about tobacco, and subsequently we see the Marshall Institute and other groups actively recruiting scientists to claim that there's no global warming.
Talk a bit about the role of the media, whether it was in the 70s with tobacco and cancer, or in more recent times with climate change. The media tends to either want to give both sides of the argument equal airtime to set up a conflict on a panel show, or maybe just to be fair and balanced. In some cases, though, the media organisations have proprietors or editors who have taken a view that are trying to push an agenda. What did you find? Well,
so both of those. So one of the key things we talk about in the book is how the tobacco industry, and then later these other organizations like the Marshall Institute, have a conscious and explicit strategy to exploit the media ideal of balance. They know that journalists want balance. They know that journalists want to present both sides of issues, and they know that journalists want to be objective. And so they exploit that, and they say, well, we have another view. You need to give us equal time for our position. And because journalists don't realize that their view is not, in fact, supported by real science, journalists succumb to this. And so the exploitation of journalists is really a key part of the strategy. And again, we saw that in the tobacco debates back in the 70s and 80s, and then we see the same strategy being used throughout the 1990s into the present day with respect to climate change, and a host of other issues as well that we talk about in the book.
Interesting example in the papers here in Australia today. On the one hand, the Sydney Morning Herald, in reporting on comments from one of the top UN officials on climate change, was reporting along the lines of, there is growing body of evidence to suggest that climate change is responsible for the extreme weather events that have led to floods and hurricanes and so on. The Australian, owned by Rupert Murdoch, was reporting slightly differently, saying, using the same quotes, but with the headlining along the lines of, there's no proof that these floods in Queensland and elsewhere are linked to climate change. Right. Same quotes being used, very different stories, very different headlines.
Yeah, and the mantra, there's no proof, was really invented by the tobacco industry, and this is one of the things we talk about in the book. So early on, the tobacco industry realized that this was a very effective strategy because, of course, it was true. Because in science, you can never really prove anything. You can never, science isn't like mathematics or logic. You can't prove something is true. What you can simply do is evaluate the evidence and say, what is the most reasonable expectation or explanation based on what we know, based on the laws of physics and chemistry, based on all of the evidence. And so today we have a situation where climate scientists have predicted for a long time that global warming would lead to an increase in extreme weather events. They predicted floods, they predicted hurricanes, they predicted cyclones, and now we are seeing all of these things that were predicted 10, 20, 30 years ago or even longer All of these things are coming true. So the most reasonable explanation is that, in fact, scientists have correctly understood the laws of nature, and that this is, in fact, evidence for the very things that we should expect. But, of course, Rupert Murdoch and others can say, as the tobacco industry did before them, there's no proof, and they're not lying when they say that, but they are giving the public a very distorted view of the scientific evidence.
Tom Switzer, to you on this as well. How would you characterise your approach to climate change and mankind's role in it? Because it's not as simple as being a sort of a denier or a sceptic. You've looked at this in some depth.
Well, I try not to get too bogged down on the science because I'm not an authority on it, but I would describe myself as an agnostic on the science. I think there is still a lot of uncertainty, although I readily concede there has been some warming of the planet over the last 20 or so years. But interestingly, the IPCC models, there is a great deal of uncertainty because the rate of the warming has not increased to the extent that the IPCC model suggested it would in the 1990s. There has been some tapering off. Now, to the extent that that's true, that does lead one to believe that there is more uncertainty. But on the issue of one-sided media campaigns, look, I think the Australian media have actually done themselves a disservice. Day in and day out in this country, we have front-page news stories broadcast on the ABC about the carbon debate, and yet, with the exception of about 2, maybe 3 columnists, the news of the Canadian election has hardly been mentioned. And this was a significant result. This was a Canadian Conservative Prime Minister gaining seats on the back of opposing a carbon tax or an ETS. Now, this was significant news for Australia because Canada and Australia have very similar types of economies. They're very resource-rich, and this hardly got picked up at all in the mainstream press. Now, that was a classic case of how your argument goes both ways, and I would argue that in this country, especially during the time of 07 and 08 and 09, it was conducted in a heretic-hunting and anti-intellectual environment where sceptics were hardly heard. And indeed, it was not only impermissible to question the science a lot of the time, it was impermissible to question the response. So I think this debate can go both ways.
Yeah.
Well, may I respond to that?
Of course.
I can't understand really what you mean when you say I'm an agnostic. I mean, to me, to say that you're agnostic excuse me, I listened to what you said. Please let me speak.
Yeah, sure.
To say you're agnostic about the science, to me, only makes sense if you, in fact, have not been paying attention or don't understand the science, because the scientific evidence is now overwhelming, and anyone who's paid attention to it, anyone who understands it, anyone who understands the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere knows that scientists predicted climate change from increased greenhouse gases and deforestation going back to the 1950s. They have built models. Of course, models are representations of the natural world. They are not the world itself. So, of course, there will always be uncertainties about the details, but the overall picture is overwhelmingly clear, and it's exactly what scientists have predicted. And if you talk about the IPCC forecast, my graduate students and I have studied this. We've looked at what the scientists have predicted on this issue over the past 50 years, and we find that in most cases, scientists have actually underestimated the change. We see sea level rising faster than predicted. We see overall global temperatures rising faster than predicted. We see sea surface temperatures in the Caribbean rising faster than predicted. So if anything, scientists have been conservative on this issue, and now we are seeing the changes all around us.
In your book, do you focus on any kind of scandals that have been affiliated with the IPCC, such as the Glaciergate? You talk about that? Well,
that happened after our book was finished, but I think the so-called Glaciergate was a typographic error. The IPCC reports are thousands of pages long. In any human activity, in any human institution, of course there will be some mistakes. I'm sure there's some mistakes in your work too, but you haven't had teams of people, you haven't had teams of people scouring it. I actually think that the fact that the IPCC report is thousands of pages long and the only errors that were found
It was a pretty significant error.
No, it was a typographical error.
No, it wasn't more than that. It was based on dodgy research from the travel document.
The studies of it showed that in fact it was a typographical error.
Please.
So, no, not please. It was a typographical error.
The IPCC chairman nearly resigned over the matter. This was a pretty serious issue, wasn't it, Chris?
Excuse me, the IPCC chairman was the choice of the Bush
administration. Let's take a time out on that particular
Yeah.
point, because there's a more sort of philosophical issue I'd like to get your thoughts on, Waleed. Do you think that, given that, as Tom says, he's not a scientist, I'm not a scientist, we do have a scientist here, but most of us are not scientists, are people more inclined to believe one side or the other? Conservatives seem to be more sceptical, progressives seem to be more willing to accept the fact that we need to do something about man-made climate change. You can almost sort of, pick it by postcode or political affiliation.
You go further. What I found interesting is that often you can match someone's attitude to the science of climate change with their attitudes on social issues as well. There's this really interesting mix. So what I think that demonstrates is that for most people, this is not about the science at all. They will cherry pick the scientific discourse that suits their purposes, whether it's from a blog or it's somewhere else, or from a paid scientist. But they will shape the scientific data that they get or that they choose to map their overall worldview, or to match their overall worldview. And I mean, it doesn't surprise me, though, when you say that conservatives, and I have a problem with the way that term's often used, but conservatives talk about are more inclined to deny climate change. Well, yeah, because if climate change is real, if the science is real, and the kind of action that the science demands is now our duty to undertake, then that means a radical reordering of the economy. It means a radical reordering of a whole lot of social structures, and we just don't want to go there. And particularly, and this is a point where I'm sure Chris will get grumpy with me, but particularly those
I would never get grumpy with you.
Oh, come on, I've seen it. But particularly those who are of a neoliberal mindset. If they've got a very strong ideological attachment to the free market, and this as a political philosophy that is to be embraced, then climate change represents a colossal challenge, because, of course, one of the key drivers of it has been the Industrial Revolution and the embrace of free markets. So it's the fact that it totally changes the political and economic and social calculus that means that the science is dead last when it comes to figuring out what our response is.
Now, let's give Chris a chance to get a bit grumpy for a moment. Chris?
Naomi, I think it sounds like a fascinating book, and I look forward to reading it. But I'm not totally convinced by what appears to be an almost conspiracy theory mindset. Now, I'm not sure how the debate is played out in the United States, but in Australia, there's something like 60% of Australians think the planet should get the benefit of the doubt on climate change, and half of those think very, very strongly that the government should act on climate change. But the reason that they haven't acted, the reason that governments are stuck in this political problem, is because people don't want to pay the amount of money that it would require to act on climate change. Now, now perhaps there are some US-based think tanks that have set up the idea that tax is bad, but I don't think anybody had to give anyone the idea that they don't want to pay extra for what is a pretty basic part of living. So I'm not sure how this plays out in any political context.
No, I mean, finally, to you on this, I mean, are we looking at another parallel here with tobacco? Ultimately, people who are addicted to tobacco would quite like to believe that it's not bad for them because they want to smoke, and people addicted to carbon want to keep polluting.
Well, exactly, and I think what you said a moment ago is exactly right. I mean, this issue is very difficult because it challenges the basic fundamental basis of our economy, which is that we tap the energy in fossil fuels. So people who are reluctant to admit that there could be a problem have attacked the science, but they're attacking the messenger. They're saying, I don't want to believe that our economic system has a fundamental flaw, that there's an Achilles heel here in this system, and that Achilles heel is what greenhouse gases do to the environment. So instead of accepting the scientific evidence and then having a reasonable debate about the different alternatives and the pros and cons of carbon taxes or emission trading or other alternatives, instead they deny the science, they attack the science, they attack the IPCC, they try to distract the issue by having an argument about petroleum or something like that, when the real issue is that we do have this Achilles heel in our economic system, and if we don't address it, we will all be suffering the consequences.
Well, we're not going to be able to address it all tonight, but thank you all for taking part. We are out of time. Thanks to our panel, Tom Switzer, Walid Ali, and in Melbourne, Chris Berg. You can check out the website at abc.net.au/The Drum. See you tomorrow.